This is the moment a criminal gang took over a television station in Ecuador. They pointed guns at the crew, held up sticks of dynamite and hand grenades, and held several people hostage. It was all broadcast live across Ecuador. Then the whole world saw it.
Turn now to the chilling images coming in from Ecuador late today.
Where armed men
stormed a state television station during a live broadcast.
Ecuador's national police chief calling it a terrorist act.
For those watching abroad, this was a shock. Latin America has been plagued for decades by violence, but Ecuador has been known as an island of peace. As recently as 2018, it had one of the lowest murder rates in the region, but in just 5 years, it's skyrocketed to one of the highest.
This is an extraordinary acceleration in violence and in the evolution of Ecuadorian organized crime structures.
And it's not just Ecuador. Violence is surging across Latin America, and it all has to do with this.
Cocaine is the criminal steroid. As soon as you successfully get involved, the profit margins are so enormous that you can develop, evolve, and strengthen in a very, very short period of time.
So in today's episode, I'm going to show you how the international cocaine market is changing right now, drawing in new customers, new sellers, new competition, and trapped in the middle, new victims. So today's story is taking place mostly on a map. This one is about trafficking routes, how gangs get cocaine from one place to another. And even though cocaine is an illegal and black market, I was surprised to see how much of the routes is well documented. There is incredible work done by really brave organizations and journalists tracking all of these routes. And so with this information, I can design a map that helps you understand exactly what's going on here. So let's begin at the start.
The start of the cocaine pipeline has always been in the Andes. Up here, farmers grow a leafy bush called coca, and then hand it off to criminal gangs who process and smuggle it to where the customers are, which at first was overwhelmingly the United States. This trade picked up in the 1970s when Colombian gangs began moving cocaine using small airplanes, boats, and even submarines through the Caribbean and into the US. These were the first major trafficking routes. Controlling these routes made the Colombian gangs very powerful, and when they faced competition, extremely violent. You probably know this part of the story.
Pablo Escobar was shot and killed by Colombia police yesterday.
The Cali cartel will now simply step up its own drug production.
An estimated $2 billion in yearly profits.
The infamous Cali drug cartel in Colombia pleaded guilty to a charge of a conspiracy to import cocaine.
But the US wasn't the only place that wanted cocaine. There was demand in Europe too, though not nearly as much. The trick for the gangs was how to get it there. Too far to use small boats or planes, gangs instead began smuggling cocaine through South American ports and onto container ships. They could choose between several ports, but one was especially ideal.
Guayaquil is a major container port. It does go directly to Europe and to other parts of the world.
Jeremy McDermott is the co-founder of Insight Crime, an organization that tracks crime in the Americas.
Initially, there was very little resistance. Port authorities in Guayaquil at that time were very easy to corrupt.
Using this route through Ecuador also helped get cocaine through ports in Europe.
In those days, stuff out of Ecuador wasn't being red flagged. So the containers arriving from Ecuador were like, okay, let's wave those through, particularly since they're fruit and perishable, quick.
From there, South American gangs would either distribute the cocaine themselves or sell it to European criminal groups. This route was less lucrative than those that went to the US, but still profitable. And one group had control over a key part of it. The FARC was a rebel group waging a bloody war against the Colombian government. In the 1990s, they controlled this territory along the border, and therefore this route to Europe.
They were a one-stop shop for drug traffickers. They had access to the raw material, they would protect your laboratories, they could move the consignments, even through much of Ecuador.
And unlike in Colombia, there weren't many gangs in Ecuador challenging the FARC over this route. Well, because the FARC was
more than 10,000 strong, with more than 50 years of combat experience. You didn't mess with the FARC.
The FARC's strength meant it didn't have to use much violence here, which is largely why Ecuador's murder rate was much lower than its neighbors. even though it did have a large cocaine trade. Ecuador was a so-called island of peace until suddenly the market shifted.
Now, this is a story that's been bubbling kind of under the surface for many years, and I found it by tracking news sources in South America. For example, yesterday I found this article: another mayor in Ecuador was assassinated by a drug gang, and I actually found it using Ground News, which is the sponsor for this week's video. Ground News is a website, a browser plugin, and a mobile app that gives you a more data-driven and transparent way to view the news. So they've got access to over 50,000 news sources all across the political spectrum, and they've got a number of tools that allow you to understand the news better and see where the news is coming from. Right now, if you go to ground.news/search party, you can get 40% off their Advantage plan. And so let me show you how it works. Okay, so this was the article I was telling you about. So here what we have is the coverage details. This will tell you based on this story in Ecuador, 50 sources are covering it, which is great. And this will tell you where they're leaning on the political spectrum. So pretty balanced here. You can see the bias distribution again below it. This is super helpful. But what I also want to show you about Ground News is that it's super customizable. So up here, I have the US edition selected, but there's also international, UK, Canada, and Europe. So you can get stories from all over the world. That's super important for me. What I also want to show you here is called the My News bias. So here you can see my most read sources and where they lie on the political spectrum here. The other thing you can do is you can create your own feed. So up here, if we go to Discover Topics, it'll show you all the kinds of stories that are being covered, and you can add them to your feed. But I do want to add some new ones for upcoming stories. So let's follow Iran, let's follow Palestine, and let's follow some sports right here. Again, if you go to this link, ground.news/search party, you can get 40% off their Advantage plan. Ground News and Search Party are both new independent journalism projects. So if you like that kind of thing, I really encourage you to give them a shot. Thanks again to Ground News. And now let's get back to the video.
Beginning in the 2000s, U.S. demand for cocaine fell, then flatlined, for a few reasons. One, American users began preferring heroin, meth, and eventually synthetic opioids. Second, after the U.S. and Colombia tightened security along these routes, Mexican gangs created new ones overland, which gave them total dominance of the U.S. cocaine market.
So there's not much more room to develop the cocaine business within the United States. Europe is a different story.
Selling cocaine there suddenly had advantages. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, capitalism was expanding eastward, opening up new cocaine markets with little competition. Europe was also spending far less money on anti-drug security than the US was, so there was a lower chance of getting caught. And then there were the profits. In 2012, gangs could sell a kilogram of cocaine in the US for $29,000, or in Europe for up to $90,000. This opportunity enticed European gangs to get more involved in cocaine. They began buying it directly from gangs in South America and taking over most of the transportation and therefore most of the profit margin. Then they would kick some money back to the Latin American gangs.
The Latins are going, well, now I don't have to worry about receiving the drugs. I've only got to control the departure points. The Europeans will sort out the reception points. And I'm still going to get more than I would have done if I tried to sell it to them upstream.
The first to do this was an Italian mafia. Then Dutch gangs arrived in South America, followed by Balkan gangs, particularly Albanians. By the 2010s, these gangs were creating new routes to Europe and flooding it with cocaine. That led to a dramatic rise in demand there. And in response, South American farmers grew more coca. Then every year, European port authorities reported more cocaine passing through their borders. By the late 2010s, these routes were the most lucrative in the world, and the best one was suddenly up for grabs.
After more than 5 decades of bloodshed, there may be a chance for peace in Colombia again. The Colombian government and the Marxist guerrillas known as FARC are due to sign a revised peace deal Thursday.
In 2016, the FARC made a deal with the Colombian government and disbanded, ending a 52 years long war. It was an incredible moment of promise in Colombia, but it had catastrophic consequences in Ecuador. The FARC's surrender left a dangerous power vacuum along this route. Smaller Ecuadorian gangs rushed to fill it, backed by European and Mexican criminal groups who provided them money, men, and heavy weapons. Ecuador's government was caught unprepared. In 2014, the president had kicked U.S. anti-drug agencies out of the country, leaving Ecuador without crucial personnel, intelligence, and technology to monitor the gangs. Then the next two presidents faced economic issues and cut security spending, making it hard to react to signs that the gangs were strengthening, like when a series of riots broke out in Ecuador's jails.
Prisons tend to be centers of organized crime in Latin America. When you see prisons slipping out of control, you go, this cannot end well. And yet they were unable to get a grip of the prisons.
As the gang wars escalated, Ecuador's homicide rate ticked up, then exploded more than 200% in 2022. More than half of those murders took place in the provinces around the Guayaquil port. Ecuador was engulfed in a full-blown proxy war over this trafficking route. By the summer of 2023, the gangs were strong enough to assassinate a presidential candidate. Then in January 2024, a gang leader escaped prison, setting off a surge of violence that the whole world would see. A few days later, a gang killed an anti-corruption prosecutor.
And so Ecuador is caught in Colombian hurricane, which is the demobilization of the FARC guerrillas, and is caught in a globalized storm of, we want more cocaine, the market is there.
Ecuador's new president, Daniel Noboa, is now using the military to arrest thousands of suspected gang leaders and retake control of the prisons. But his government is poor, corrupt, and up against rich and heavily armed gangs who are determined to control this route.
President Noboa doesn't have many cards to play. He has to show that the government isn't impotent. It probably does have the playbook, just not the resources to follow it.
Unfortunately, Ecuador isn't the only country with this problem. Today, 18 out of the 21 Latin American countries are considered by the UN to be a main source or transit point for cocaine. While governments have tightened security at ports in major cocaine-producing countries like Colombia and Peru, drug gangs are adapting by forging new routes through new countries, like Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and especially the Caribbean countries. Each is now seeing a surge of violence like never before, and their governments are struggling to solve it. It's a difficult problem for them to solve because ultimately, any solution depends on the choices of people an ocean away.
All right, thanks for watching episode 11. We've had incredible growth over the last 7 months. Thank you all for subscribing. Welcome to anyone who's new to Search Party. As usual, we have information about our membership program that's in the description below. But most importantly, keep sending in those recommendations for story ideas. They're really exciting to do, and I hope to do more of them in the future. As for now, thanks for watching again, and keep an eye out for more stories coming more frequently this summer. All right, thanks everyone.